for inviting me. Now, look, sorry, the topic today is what makes a Christian space holy. And just by way of some background and disclaimer, so as I mentioned before, I work in the field of planning and development law. I do have a master's in urban and regional planning or town planning, which is essentially a discipline about spaces and the use of spaces. And but another interesting part of my role, which I briefly mentioned in the intro before, I also work in the field of heritage and including Aboriginal heritage, which, even though it's from a secular point of view, it does involve the question of sacred space. There's a sign there. Hope everyone can see the slides. There's a sign there about it's an offence to do certain things within this area. That's linked to questions of sacredness and sacred space. So I would say that this issue of sacred space is one that I've thought about before. Look, I'd like to think that I was clever enough to come up with all this myself, but to be quite fair, not everything, but some of what I've got to share today comes from a lecture I heard from an Anglican theology professor maybe 15 years ago, the name of whom I can't quite remember, sad to say. I've since found that there's some elements of what I've got to say is in a book by a guy called Jonathan Hill, Christianity in the First 400 Years. So what I'm saying by way of disclaimer is, look, this is not a PhD thesis. This is just another random area that I have had some interest. I do have some background, but look, I'm not dogmatic about what I'm about to share. So feel free to disagree politely, as was said. Look, if you've asked a question, I may well have as many questions back for you. So with that, this is a bit of an exploration. And again, keep in mind, I'm probably going to be asking you as many questions as answers I will give. Right. Now, if we're going to talk about holy spaces, I think we need to just upfront, what do we mean by space? Now, when I talk about spaces or space, I'm really talking about physical space. So talking about the dimensions of height, depth, width, within which all things exist and move. So I'm talking about things. We're talking about holy things. And those things could be a building. They could be an object like a car. They could be a piece of geography like a mountain. They could be a living thing like a person. We probably don't think of people as spaces, but we occupy 3 dimensions: height, depth, width. And there's some nuance here as well. We could have a person in a car, so a space within a space. And we could have a person on a mountain. So when we're talking about space, we're really talking about things. So now to the scope. I really want to explore 3 questions with everyone. What does sacred or holy mean? How do we make a space holy? And why do Christians have churches, not temples? And thirdly, what are the implications of Christian holy space for followers of Jesus? So question 1, what does holy and sacred mean? Now, as was mentioned, I'm currently living in France, and I do have some background in the question of space as a town planning lawyer. But what really, I guess, kick-started this deeper exploration was my time in France. And one thing that really shocked me in France was just how many amazing churches there are everywhere. The picture on the left-hand side is from Reims Cathedral. It's arguably the most important church in France because it is the church, which you may or may not know, that is the church that you have to be anointed in to be crowned King of France. So in some ways, it's more important than any other church in France. The thing about the churches in France are they're so amazing, yet so empty, so devoid of people. As you may know, France is one of the most secular countries in the world. And what really shocked me as I've travelled around is you often go into a church and you'll discover there's a sign that says the church is now owned by the French government. And why is that? Because the congregation has become so low that the church, the Catholic Church in this case, can't actually afford the upkeep of the building. So the French state has taken over it. And I remember discussing this with my wife after about the fourth or fifth such church we had visited, and discussing with her, hey, at what point does this cease to be a church? Like, if the congregation reduces to zero and no one attends at all, is it still a sacred space? Is it still a church? It was such a fascinating question. The second French-related example that really spurred me to explore this further was the burning down of the church in Notre Dame, Paris. If you recall, when it's just recently been fixed after a couple of years and refurbished. Got a photo at the end. But it prodded the same type of introspection. When that church burnt down, did the church still exist? Did that sacred space still exist, or did the sacred space end? And so what makes a church? What makes a space, in this case buildings, holy? And then it led to some other thinking. Hey, maybe even looking beyond Christianity. Are holy buildings, objects, places, and people, things, as we discussed at the beginning, are they universal ideas? And it seemed to me, yes, they are. You find in almost every culture, religion, society, there seems to be this notion of sacred space. And to give just a few examples, we've got the Holy Mosque in Mecca there. The centre one, we've got Uluru in central desert Australia. You used to be able to climb on top of it, but that's now since forbidden because the traditional owners consider it sacrilegious. We've got some Buddhist prayer wheels there. And then you might be thinking, oh, well, that's just a religious thing then. But I would challenge you on that. I would challenge you to say, well, maybe this idea of sacred space is so universal, we even have secular versions of it. So the example there in the bottom left-hand corner, Gallipoli, you've probably never heard of it. It's a small battlefield site on a peninsula in Turkey, near Istanbul. It's hard for me to explain to outsiders, but essentially that's the most sacred ground in all of Australia, even though it's not in Australia. It's where the first major battle involving Australian troops happened in 1914, and from birth, from primary school to high school, we're really taught that this is sacred ground. And as a result, thousands of Australians go to visit this site. I've been there. And yeah, it's weird because obviously it's a secular place, but it has this sort of underlying reverence or sacred meaning. Maybe a US equivalent would be something like the Gettysburg battlefield or Shiloh or maybe Bunker Hill. I don't know, but something similar to that. If we look at objects, and to use an American example, consider the Declaration of Independence. Now, I'm sure many Americans, regardless of their religion, maybe even if they're an atheist, they would consider that almost a sacred document. If I said to you, well, who cares? It's just a piece of paper. It's just some ink. You can have it, who cares what happens to that document? Like, we've got backups where you can go onto the internet and see what's written there. I think many people would be outraged with that. They feel that the document itself has this sort of intrinsic importance, which goes beyond just the idea of just some words on a page. And finally, even people. I like to think of the British royal family. I don't know if people saw recently when the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer invited President Trump for his second state visit, and how much his eyes sort of lit up almost by the invitation. The British royal family, they almost seem to have this sort of sacredness about them as people. I remember a few years ago when the Obamas visited the late Queen Elizabeth, and there was a bit of a controversy when Michelle Obama, innocently and quite lovingly, but she had touched the Queen, and that was considered almost a sacrilegious act, that the Queen was so almost holy that she was not to be touched. So the point I'm saying is that this question of sacred space, and by that I mean buildings, objects, places, and people, it seems to be something universal to being a human being. And because it is such a universal idea, look, this presentation is primarily looking from a biblical point of view, but I think it is useful to look at some sociological definitions of sacred or holy. I should just make clear, when I use the word sacred or holy, I'm using them largely interchangeably. If you get your dictionary out, they're mostly used interchangeably. There's some debate about whether there is a slight difference, but for the purpose of this presentation, I mean the same thing. And looking at some of these sociological definitions, we've got Emil Durkheim. He's got his famous sacred versus profane. For him, the sacred is something that is set apart and forbidden. We have Rudolf Otto's numinous experience. For him, the sacred is something that is otherworldly, shocking, yet wonderful. We have Mircea Eliade's Hierophany and Axis Mundi. For him, the sacred are places and objects where the divine breaks into the ordinary world. And finally, we have Mary Douglas. For her, holiness was seen as wholeness. It's a thing in its proper place, something that is orderly. Now, despite looking at these from a universal perspective, it's quite interesting that most of these sociologists use as their quintessential example of sacredness Moses' encounter with God in the burning bush. So if you remember the story, Moses goes on top of a mountain. Often mountains are seen as that idea, the axis mundi. It's like the earth rising up to the heavens. So the divine is breaking into the ordinary world. When Moses first gets there, what does God tell him? Take off your shoes, for you are in holy ground. So this idea of the space being set apart and forbidden. Then Moses' encounter with God. It's an otherworldly, it's a shocking yet wonderful experience. I think the picture there helps sort of capture it in his eyes. And finally, the experience sort of makes Moses whole. Despite wrestling with God, Moses kind of fulfills his destiny. He gets back on track. He's in his proper place. Moving from the sociological definition to the biblical definition, I think we kind of get the same idea. It actually conforms to that broader sociological definition. And we've got various words in the Bible for sacred or holy. Essentially means holy, set apart, sacred, different, signifies purity, sanctity, and separation from the common or more mundane. And for me, the key ones are the idea of being set apart. Holiness is something that's set apart, and something that is separation from the common or mundane. Another really good example to illustrate what we're talking about is the temple in Jerusalem, the old Herod's temple or Solomon's temple. We see the different elements of sacred there. We've got a building or buildings with different levels of sacredness, if you recall. The court of the Gentiles, women's court, the court of the Israelites, court of the Levites, the holy place, the most holy place. We had objects such as the Ark of the Covenant. We had places, cities, towns, mountains. So obviously it's Jerusalem is the sacred geography, with Mount Zion being the more sacred spot within Jerusalem. And then we have people, holy people, which are the priests. So we have all those four elements: buildings, objects, places, and people. And if we're going to define what is sacred or holy, maybe we need to ask ourselves, well, what's the opposite? Now, the opposite is often described as being something that is either unclean or defiled. Again, we've got a bunch of biblical words there that sort of capture this idea: unclean, impure, common, to spoil, stain, pollute, mixed or wrong mix, or to make common. But what's quite interesting in this discussion about what is the opposite of sacred is there's sort of not agreement. There seems to be some disagreement about what it is, or it could be multiple things. So for someone like Durkheim, he said actually the opposite of holy is the common. So I like to think of the example of McDonald's, a McDonald's restaurant. Look, it's a private corporation, but I would almost say McDonald's are the world's common space. Doesn't matter where you go in the world. If you travel, I've traveled a lot, you can get the same menu. Everyone often speaks English. You can use toilets. It's a common space. And that's precisely why a lot of people don't like it, because it's so common. But for others, such as Douglas, she was like, no, it's not so much common. It's more about ambiguous spaces. It's spaces that mix the holy with the common and therefore put things out of its proper place. Just an example that came to my mind is the idea of clothing as objects. your Sunday best or Sabbath best. Now, a lot of people don't like it if you don't dress up for church. And, they see it as a disrespect to God. But I would ask, well, what's disrespectful about it? If I wear jeans and a T-shirt, what's the problem? And I think deep down what's happening is people are feeling that you're mixing the everyday clothing of the week with, a special, with something that's meant to be set special and set aside. So it's a mixing. It's a fear of the mixing of the everyday with the holy. And finally, both Durkheim and Douglas seem to be open to the idea of actually, when we talk about the opposite of holy, what we're really talking about is a place that is still set apart, but it's set apart in a negative way. So it is set apart space. It's still sacred space, but it's unlucky sacred space, or in the words of Durkheim, or it's cursed space in the language of Douglas. And to use an example, if we all went on a field trip to a satanic church, putting aside the fact that Satanists are mostly atheists, if we went to a satanic church, I suspect most of you would feel very uncomfortable. Not because that space is common, it's not like a McDonald's. You would realize it's a special place, but it's special in a negative way. So it's unlucky sacred. It's a negative sacred space. So from that, we have sacred, which is to be set apart, and then we have the opposite, unclean or defiled. But keep in mind, it can be a bit complicated. There are at least sort of 3 different ways of looking at the opposite. If we're looking at the idea of sacred space, I think we also need to briefly explore the idea of sacred contagion. This is the idea that holiness, both lucky and unlucky sacred, can pass to others. So a good biblical example of the positive is Elijah when he shares his clothing, his mantle with Elisha, almost passing on some of that holiness, that power. And if we want an example of unlucky sacred, we think of the story of Jonah, where Jonah himself became the unlucky sacred space. So if you all know the story, Jonah's told to go to Nineveh. Does he go to Nineveh? No, he runs away, hops on a ship, runs away for Tarsus. There's a massive storm. So it's not that God rejected Jonah and made him a common man again. He remained sacred. He remained set apart as a prophet, but he became unlucky. He became unlucky sacred, to the point that when the storm happened, all the other sailors cast lots to see who was causing it, which God was responsible. And in this theme of unluckiness, they cast lots and the lot fell on Jonah. And so what did they do? Because it was almost Jonah was infecting them all with this bad luck. What did they do? At Jonah's own insistence, they threw him overboard and he was swallowed by the fish. So when we talk about holiness and holy sacred spaces, there's this other concept that holiness it's almost infectious. It can pass to other people, both in positive and negative ways. And finally, if we're going to talk about holiness, we need to be careful that we're not confusing it as, holiness can be confusing, but we need to be careful that we're not just dealing with a question of health and hygiene. Now, modern Christians, Adventists included, and especially, it's very easy for us to read things with our own modern lens. We know germs exist, and assume that's how everyone would have looked at it thousands of years ago. And I just use a simple example of blood. Now, in the Bible, blood can be seen as a cleansing thing, the blood of certain animals in certain circumstances, and in other contexts, blood can be seen as an unclean thing, and I think of menstrual blood. So when the law says the law requires nearly everything to be cleansed with blood, to state, I hope, the obvious, we're not talking about a matter of hygiene, because I hope you'd agree with me, if you want to clean your house, blood is not a particularly good disinfectant, okay? We're clearly talking about a symbol here. We're talking about a religious concept. And as Christians, we know, of course, the blood was all symbolic of Jesus blood. So when we talk about things that are clean and unclean, just be careful that when we're assuming we're talking about hygiene, because sometimes we're not talking about hygiene, we're talking about some other symbolic, deeper meaning. Okay, so the punchline of the first question, what is a holy space? Holy spaces are things set apart, but it can be a bit complicated and contextually driven. Good example of this is when the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant. Now, when the Israelites had the Ark of the Covenant, it was a lucky sacred object. They were winning battles. But when the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant, it was still a sacred object, but it became an unlucky sacred object. Because what happened? You know the story. But after the Philistines had moved it, the Lord's hand was against the city, throwing it into a great panic. He inflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with outbreak of tumours. So they sent the Ark of God to Ekron. So when we talk about holy spaces, there's context, there's everything. And it does make it does make it a bit complicated. But essentially we are talking about things set apart. So with that, question 2, how do we make a space holy, and why do Christians have churches, not temples? So we now know that sacred spaces are spaces set apart. But the question then is, how exactly are these places made sacred or holy? And I want to give you a few examples here. And I'm not going to give you the answer either, by the way. So you got to think about this and discuss it maybe in the chat amongst yourselves. So the one on the top left-hand corner, for the first 14 years of my life, the Adventist church I attended met in a school. So here's the question. When we met in the school, was that school a sacred space? Because or was it not? And if it was, did it remain a sacred space, or did it turn back into a non-sacred space when we left? That's the first one. The top middle example, does anyone know what that is? It's the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It used to be one of the world's biggest churches. Now it's one of the world's biggest mosques. So is it the fact that it became a mosque in Christian terms? Does it still remain a church? Does it still remain a sacred space in Christian terms? Good question. The third example on the top, that's a nightclub. It's a church that's been converted to a nightclub. The fact that it's now a nightclub, is it still a church? Is it still sacred space in Christian terms? Be interested to see what you think. The bottom row on the left, it's a foyer, church foyer. We might also talk about the church hall, church kitchen, maybe even the church toilet. So when people ask you, what did you discuss at the Sabbath school? Say we discussed the sacredness of the church toilet. Now, that is these are areas that are sort of set apart from this quote-unquote the sanctuary. The fact that we even use the term the sanctuary often is quite interesting. But these spaces, are they sacred? Is the church foyer a sacred space? Or is it a mundane space? Or is it something in between? And keep in mind, we discovered that things that are a mixture between sacred and common are often seen as unclean. So that's a weird question for us. What sort of space is the church foyer? At the bottom picture, that's actually my family there, having lunch at our local Adventist church here in Reims, France. Now, the church there is so small that when they have a luncheon, they actually have to turn the pews in on each other, and you have to actually eat in the hall. There's actually no room to eat outside. And given we were there when it was -7, the option to eat outside also wasn't possible. So question for you, is it possible to eat lunch in the quote-unquote sanctuary? When we ate lunch, did the space remain holy? Did it become unholy? What was its status? And finally, I got the example, we're all here today in a virtual realm. So in what sense are we involved with sacred space? Are we a church? Where is this sacred space? Good question. So with those one, and I gave you them to start thinking about this issue. So understanding that sacred space is space that's set apart, how does one make sacred space? And I think the starting point is to realize that it seems, biblically speaking, that God's presence seems to make a space holy. And to return to our quintessential example of Moses with the burning bush, do not come any closer, God said. take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. So it appears that Moses coming into the presence of God is what has made this space holy. Other good example, often quoted, including by Adventists, is when God said, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I might dwell among them." So what made the sanctuary holy? It was the fact that God dwelt amongst his people through that building, through that structure. But if God's presence makes spaces holy, I think we're left with a bit of a problem, because why then do we have churches, not temples? Because the biblical word for temple literally means a shrine, the most sacred part where God himself, or gods if you're a pagan, dwells. So a temple is where God dwells, whereas a church, ecclesia, is merely an assembly or gathering of people, a congregation. So if a temple is where God dwells, and where God dwells is what makes the space holy, why aren't we meeting in temples? Why are we meeting in an assembly or gathering of people? And if you look at the history of the early church, it's fairly well known, and I don't think it's controversial, that they didn't have separate set-aside buildings. They didn't have temples. They met where? In people's homes, ordinary homes. On at least one occasion, they also met, and probably a lot more occasions, they also met in public, open spaces. In the story of Lydia and Lydia's conversion, she seems to come across essentially a church gathering outside by a river. So why do we then meet in churches, not temples? Now, some might say, well, the reason for that is because there already was a temple in Jesus' day. Okay, that's a good argument. But of course, that temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, as Jesus had prophesied. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another, everyone will be thrown down. So if the temple, the Jewish temple, was destroyed, how come in Christian history and tradition and biblically and in New Testament thought, how come our churches didn't become temples? Now, some of you might be tempted to think, well, they basically are temples now. Again, we use that language, don't we? The sanctuary, to mean the part where, the pastor gives the sermon and the people sing some songs, and, we have the pulpit. So they basically are temples. But my challenge to you is, it's deliberate that the New Testament does not use the word temple in relation to where Christians meet. Okay, I suspect, and this is my theory, that it is a deliberate decision, because it goes to a very important theological point that the apostles and early Christians understood. And the point they understood was, buildings are not intrinsically or permanently holy. You see this with Paul. This is one of Paul's key arguments when dealing with the pagans in Athens, to the altar of the unknown God. Paul tells them, God, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with human hands. And it's not just Paul, Stephen. And if you recall, Paul, then Saul, witnessed Stephen's speech on this matter, where Stephen had said, the Most High does not dwell in houses made by human hands. Now, we could almost have an entire lesson just on Stephen's speech. It's so important on this topic. But to quote Jonathan Hill, again, I cited him at the beginning, he helps explain what's going on here. He says, Stephen gives a long speech to the council about the patriarchs and prophets, concluding that the Jews have always persecuted those whom God has sent, and describing the building of the temple itself as a sign of the rejection of God by Solomon, for God cannot be located in a physical building. So did you get that? Stephen was saying, not only is the temple no longer holy because of Jesus, he's saying it's actually a sign of God's rejection of Israel. And Jonathan Hill, I think it is, he goes on to explain that phrase there, made with human hands, in relation to the temple. Early in Stephen's speech, he uses the same phrase, and he uses that phrase in relation to the golden calf. So in other words, Stephen is saying that your temple, which is the center at that time, Second Temple Judaism, the center of their religion, the place that they thought that was the most holy place on earth, not only is it not holy, it's actually evil, it's idolatry, it's equivalent to the golden calf. And that's why, in what otherwise seems a very long and impenetrable speech, It seems that the Jewish leaders understood that's what Stephen was saying, which is why they were so outraged and killed him then and there. So buildings are not intrinsically or permanently holy. That's what at least the first Christians seem to understand. And not just buildings, objects as well. Objects are not intrinsically or permanently holy. Good example of this is Hezekiah. Hezekiah, broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. Up until that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. So what had been a holy object that saved people had become an object of idolatry. It was not intrinsically or permanently holy. It had to be destroyed. And we could also use the example of the various objects in Herod's temple as well, that when the Romans destroyed the temple, of course, they carried those objects away from them. And not just buildings and objects. We get from the New Testament the idea that cities, mountains, and other places of sacred geography are also not intrinsically or permanently holy. We get this from Jesus himself in his discussion with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. Now, for those who know the backstory, of course, Samaritans were a mixed people. Again, that's an interesting concept in this topic. They were mixed people of Assyrian and Israelite origin, and they had a big dispute with the Jews. And the big dispute was over where the temple, where the holy mountain was to be. The Samaritans believe it was Mount Gerizim, and there's a picture of it there on the right from now. Whereas the Jews believed it was in Jerusalem, Mount Zion. But note what Jesus said to her, the woman at the well. Jesus replied, "Believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." So from Jesus, we get the strong sense that cities, mountains, and other places of sacred geography are not intrinsically or permanently holy. You might then ask, well, why then did God command ancient Israel to construct a physical building with ritual objects? Seems a bit bizarre to have this theology about buildings not being intrinsically holy and objects not being intrinsically holy, and putting the temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. If they're not inherently and permanently holy, what's the rationale behind it? Now, Rabbi Abraham Herschel, for people who know him, he's arguably the most famous Jewish rabbi of the 20th century. He explains in remarkably similar terms to Paul and Stephen. He explains it was only after the people had succumbed to the temptation of worshipping a thing, a golden calf, that the erection of the tabernacle of holiness in space was commanded. Interesting, it's from the book The Sabbath. And the punchline of his whole book is that God is not a God so much of space, but of time. Okay? There is no intrinsic holiness of space. Again, very similar to what Paul and Stephen both preached. As Christians, we also know, we've got added context, that even to the extent that the temple was somehow holy, that holiness ended in Jesus because it was just there to point to the role of Jesus in the plan of salvation. And the best, I could have a bunch of texts from Hebrews and other texts you've probably all heard of. The best illustration that comes to mind, of course, is at the crucifixion, at the moment of death, the temple curtain to the Holy of Holies ripped from top to bottom. So again, we've seen the breaking down of that holy space. The temple had lost its sacredness. So if we're saying that buildings are not intrinsically holy and objects are not intrinsically holy and sacred geography is not intrinsically holy, what's left? There's only one thing left. Yep, and the punchline, which some of you may have already thought of, it's people. People are the answer to this question. We meet in churches, literally assemblies, because it is people who are the holy spaces where God dwells. Okay, go right back to the beginning of the Bible. God makes humankind in his own image, man and female, man and woman, male and female. The example of Jesus himself as the premier example. Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." And they were shocked, how 40 years it took to build. But the temple he had spoke of was what? His body. His body was the temple. And of course, the text from 1 Corinthians 6, which Adventists and other Christians love to quote, "Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you." So why do we have churches and not temples? Because your body is the temple. We're a congregation of people. We're a collection of temples. Each one of us is a temple. Okay? Does that mean there can never be then a holy building or a holy object or a holy place? No, I'm not saying that. I think that would be an extreme. That would take what I've said to the extreme. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is Jesus' followers can lend sacredness to buildings, objects, and places, but only people are permanently and intrinsically holy. The scriptures tell us that where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among them. So to use that school example, the school that I met in for my first Adventist church for the first 14 years of my life, I believe when we met in that school, that space did become holy. It did become a holy space. Why? Because of our presence and with God inside of us. Jesus tells us, where is the kingdom of heaven? Yeah, it's a physical place up in the sky somewhere, but it's also within you. And that's quite an important idea. So you're carrying around, through the Holy Spirit, you're carrying around this sacred space within you. And to further illustrate what I'm trying to get at, there's a really good, weird story in the New Testament in Acts where when Peter walks around and his shadow casts across people, his shadow heals people. And it's a really weird story, but I think it actually helps explain this idea. I like the idea of a shadow because a shadow is connected. The shadow is connected to Peter. But at the same time, it's a temporary thing, isn't it? So it's not as if that actual spot on the ground forevermore was one where you could come and be healed. It's obviously it moved. It was connected to Peter. And it sort of showed this idea of sacredness being lent rather than sacredness being intrinsic to a particular spot, to a particular space. If you're struggling to understand what I'm trying to say, another good analogy that comes to mind is Air Force One. I call it the Air Force One model of sacredness. So trick question, how many Air Force Ones are there? Now, hopefully as Americans, you'll know this better than me, but my understanding is there's actually at least two physical planes. So in terms of the actual plane, there's at least two of them. But here's the catch. Whichever plane the president is in at that time, that plane becomes Air Force One. Okay? So it's the president's presence in that space that creates the space, makes the space holy. And that's kind of what I'm talking about, that there can be holy spaces, there can be holy objects, there can be holy places, but that holiness is lent to it through our present with the Holy Spirit living inside of us. And the third punchline, when I'm talking about humans being intrinsically and permanently holy, just to be clear, I'm talking about people who are alive. Because God himself, of course, God alone owns the sacredness, and Jesus' followers are only lent that sacredness from God while we are alive, so we better use it. So, of course, whilst we're alive, we're temples, and once we die, the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. And I think this idea, as Adventists, with our understanding of the state of the dead, this is easier for us to understand, that we just cease to exist, essentially. You are from the dust you return. And then Jesus even saying quite provocative things like, let the dead bury their dead. As a side note, and I think that's a good question maybe for someone to raise in the discussion, I do raise some questions about our funeral practices. Is a deceased corpse a sacred object? Is it still sacred, or has it lost its sacredness, just like the Air Force One plane that the president's not on? I'll leave that to you to have a think about, and maybe that's a good question to explore later. So question 3, what are the implications of Christian holy space for followers of Jesus? So again, just to recap, holiness or holy space is a place that's set apart, number 1. And 2, the only intrinsic holy space is people, within people whilst we're alive. And we can lend that holy space to other spaces. So what are the implications of this? Okay, I think we might not realize how radical some of these implications are. First of all, Jesus' followers break into the mundane realm eroding distinctions between sacred and mundane. So Lauren mentioned at the beginning, I like to say provocative things. I'm going to say some provocative things now, but they're not actually, liberal. They're actually quite conservative if you think about them, but they sound quite provocative when I first say them. So I really ask you to kind of think about this deeply, what I'm saying. But we're actually seeing this erosion between this notion of sacred and mundane, or sacred and common, in Christianity. The best example of this is Jesus Christ himself. There's no better example. So Jesus, who is God, is the very definition of sacred, that is separate or holy or set apart. What happens? Jesus becomes a man. There's no better dissolution of the boundary between holiness and mundaneness than Jesus himself walking around. Both God and human in everyday space. Okay, number one. And number two, I should just say I really enjoyed the Sabbath school lesson last week with Pastor Race. A lot of what I'm going to say now ties on neatly to what he said. And the whole discussion last week about communion and communion bread and what was in communion, it really is quite interesting, because what is the premier symbol that we often use for Christian, worship and practice? Our liturgy, what is it? It's a piece of bread, okay? What's interesting about that is bread is the most common, or one of the most common objects you can have. Give us this day our daily bread. So it's funny, Christianity has as its sacred object. What is its sacred object? It is an ordinary object. It's a piece of bread. There were some interesting questions raised last week about the status of the bread and whether the bread has to be burned after communion. It's another interesting question maybe for the discussion afterwards, but I'll just say briefly, I do question some of those practices and whether we're treating the bread as if it is intrinsically and permanently holy, as opposed to something that's merely lent that holiness by the presence of people involved in something. It's the people that makes the thing holy, not the thing itself, okay? So it's a good question I want you to think about, and maybe it's a good point of discussion. Last week, there was also a question about fish. There was some discussion about why is fish, one, you have, Jesus feeding the 5,000 with the fish. There's a question of fish as a symbol. There's a question about fish. Some of the early churches' communion meals involved fish. Why fish? Not sure if anyone noted this, but fish is quite a weird object or thing, I guess, because it sort of seems to traverse the sacred versus mundane distinction. So as long as the fish has scales, I'm sure many of you are aware that the kosher rules don't normally apply. So in other words, a Jew and a Gentile can sit down and both eat fish. It's quite important. Also, Jews have strict rules about milk and meat. Fish is something you can have with milk and meat. So in terms of a symbol and a practice, fish is quite a weird sort of universal object that helps break down this distinction between sacred and mundane. So it's quite interesting, apart from the fact that many of the disciples were fishermen, as a symbol of early Christianity, it's actually a symbol of the dissolution between sacred and mundane. And following from that, remember we have this idea of the sacred contagion. I would say that Jesus' followers are a good sacred contagion, a missionary religion to every place on earth. Now, this is one of those things where I think we just take it for granted, because Christianity is the world's largest religion. Islam, the second largest, is also a missionary religion. But I don't think we realize how unusual that is. Most religions are not missionary religions. In fact, most religions are horrified by the idea of telling too many people. You're normally born into it. Normally, there's sacred secret knowledge. Normally, sacred contagion is not a good thing. It's almost like a battery. There's only so much sort of energy or sacredness, and if it gets shared too much, there's sort of like the battery being drained. Well, Christianity has a completely different philosophy, where Jesus tells us we are to be the salt and light of the world. So I don't think we quite realize how unusual that is in the area of Aboriginal sacred sites. As I mentioned at the beginning, in a lot of their traditional beliefs, there's many secret places, many places that are limited to just men or just women, or certain types of men or certain types of women, because again of the fear of this sacred contagion, that the sacredness will sort of spill out and lose its sacredness. Christianity doesn't have that. In Christianity, we've got it's a battery that constantly can be recharged. It's an infinite battery. So we do not have the same fear. We are to be a good sacred contagion. And of course, that's a very different philosophy from Judaism itself, isn't it? Which is not a missionary religion. Okay, the other key thing we realize from the Christian understanding of sacred space is that Jesus' followers realize people as holy places have an inherent dignity, not made spiritually or morally unclean, defiled, or unlucky by external things. Now, this is one I think Adventists might struggle with. Please don't misunderstand what I'm about to say here, because it gets a bit tricky if I don't articulate it well. But Jesus was clear. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them: adultery, greed, malice, deceit, etc. Jesus shares the various sins. Now, Jesus is actually talking about in this story about washing hands before eating. It wasn't, and this is the point, it wasn't about hygiene. It wasn't a hygienic wash of hands. It was about a ritual cleanliness, and that's the exact point. There's much good counsel in the Bible that we follow today, that we take as counsel about hygiene. I'm not saying we shouldn't follow that. What I am saying, and this is the point, that when we're talking about questions of hygiene, we should be very careful that we do not impute into that questions of spiritual or moral cleanliness, or luckiness, or whether someone's defiled or not. So to use an example, if I do not wash my hands before eating, am I being very unhealthy? Probably. Am I being unhygienic? Yes. Am I spiritually or morally defiled? I don't think so. Jesus himself, I think, sort of went out of his way to try and prove this point with lepers. The fact that Jesus could have healed lepers from a distance, he actually went up and touched the lepers. And by touching the lepers, he himself would have been ceremonially unclean. But Jesus understood that type of uncleanliness didn't apply. Okay? Now, again, the Bible's got very sound advice about quarantining and other sort of hygiene practices. We've all lived through COVID, where we had a sound rules about quarantine. But I think you would understand that if one of us was quarantined, say for COVID, that didn't make that person inherently spiritually or morally unclean. Okay, it didn't mean they were defiled. It didn't mean they were unlucky and cursed like Jonah. Okay, the best sort of modern example I can think of is Princess Diana. Remember when she hugged the AIDS patients? She clearly understood, someone had explained to her the medical science, that she was in no danger. But it was an important moment in history for those who remember it. I think I was a bit young, because it wasn't that people were just afraid of people with AIDS from a hygiene or germ or virus sense. It's almost as if people with AIDS had gained some sort of spiritual or moral defilement, that they had become unlucky, that they had lost their inherent dignity. So her hugging them was a really important point to show that, sure, they were sick in a medical sense, but God had not abandoned them. They were not spiritually defiled. And with that, I'm going to say something a bit controversial to some of you. I use the example of pork, bacon sandwich. If I had been sitting here whilst doing this talk and ate a whole block of chocolate, some of you might, or something, I don't know, big soda or a bag of chips, some of you may well have thought, wow, that's very unhealthy. Some of you might have thought, wow, that's delicious. I wish I had some. I think I'm going to go and get something to eat now. But I doubt any of you would have thought that somehow I was spiritually or morally unclean or defiled. And yet, if I'd been eating a bacon sandwich whilst we're talking, and I'm not judging you because I would feel the same, because that's how we were raised as Adventists often, I suspect you wouldn't merely think I was being unhealthy, you would think I had something spiritually or morally wrong with me, as if I had become sort of spiritually infected, that I had become unlucky. And that's the point. Jesus' followers realize that as holy places, we have inherent dignity. We are not affected in a spiritual sense by those external things. But do not come away from this presentation and say Stephen Ferguson said I should eat bacon. I'm not saying that. Those people who follow those biblical principles, those who are vegetarian, even best, good on you. It's very good to be healthy. It's very good to be hygienic. It's very good to follow that biblical principle. But don't get the idea wrong that somehow we're going to judge people's spiritual state by those external things. Okay, so the punchline. What's the punchline of realizing? What's the implications of all this? The implication is Christian sacred spaces should be fundamentally inclusive and welcoming. Okay, inclusive and welcoming. The New Testament, not even the New Testament, sorry, the Old Testament, pointing to the New Covenant, tells us this. Okay, it uses two groups of people who were excluded from the temple: eunuchs and foreigners. And Isaiah tells us, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what pleases me and holds fast my covenant, to them I will give within my temple, I will bring them to my holy mountain, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. So in Jesus, the idea of temples, humans are temples, Holy Spirit lives in us, that temple presence can go to people who would ordinarily be excluded, okay? Now, I want you to, and we have the obviously example of Philip going to the eunuch. Also, Ethiopian eunuch, keep in mind, some scholars believe there's a bit of a point there about race as well. And also Peter going to Cornelius, the foreigner, the centurion, the Roman. So Christian spaces should be fundamentally inclusive and welcoming. That's the logical consequence of understanding that spaces, sacred spaces, are in people. Okay, and I'll let you think about, I won't say, but I'll let you think about who the eunuchs and who the foreigners might be today. Second punchline, sacred spaces should be beautiful, can be beautiful, not against that, but they should also be functional and people-focused. What do we find in the New Testament? What sort of community? We find a group of people who devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Again, I really enjoyed the discussion last week about the communal meal was originally an actual meal. I think that really emphasizes what I'm also trying to say. I've often thought that the potluck lunch is not something we do out of church, after church. I've often thought the potluck lunch is church. It is the church. That is the place where we connect with people. That is often the place where we can even connect with God. Yes, we have the sermon. Yes, we have the prayers. Yes, we have the song service. They're all good, right? They're all good. But I just wonder how what we sort of, in terms of our priorities, we think of the lunch as the afterthought. Well, I question that. I wonder if the lunch actually is the main event. That is the spot where the Spirit, in this collection of temples, of people, most manifests itself. I really like, in terms of functional and being people-orientated, I really like churches with playgrounds. Look, nothing says you can't have a beautiful church. Okay, your church might have stained glass windows. France is full of beautiful churches. When you sit in the church and you see a stained glass window and you're inspired by the architecture, that can sort of trigger something inside yourself, okay? But here's the point. The stained glass window is not in of itself holy. It's my reaction to it that is the holy, is what makes it holy. And the flip side is what we don't want. We don't want churches that are all just beautiful artifacts and museums, but are essentially devoid of people, okay? What we want is people-focused, very living churches, which is focused on people, and that includes children as a sacred space. You know, Jesus said, bring the children to me. Being in the presence of Jesus is also the very essence of holiness. What did Jesus say? Children, come to me. So spaces should include children. Finally, this is just an interesting thought I had. We find God's presence. This is the last point. We find God's presence, literally a holy space, anywhere we find people showing kindness to others. Remember, Jesus said, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters, you did for me. Again, what is a holy space? Holy space is one where we come into the presence of God. How do we come into the presence of God? We come into the presence of God by helping people, okay? And I think that lends us to some interesting exploration. Maybe holy space is broader than what we think. It's not just the church, traditionally spoken. Maybe some of our own other spaces are holy space as well. I love to think of a hospital. I love to think of a nurse in that hospital. Maybe it's an Adventist hospital. Maybe it's a nurse changing a bedpan in an Adventist hospital. Maybe it's an ugly looking building. Now, what I think why that's quite an interesting example is because in sort of Old Testament terms, that nurse and that place would not be holy. It would actually be an unclean place. You're dealing with human waste. You've got a place full of sick people. That is an unholy place. But in Jesus, I would put to you that that place, that person, that nurse is very holy. Okay? Because why? To return to that, I really like that sociological definition. Holiness is something where we find alien, shocking, yet wonderful experience. I would say in an unkind world, the most alien, shocking, yet wonderful thing is people showing kindness to each other. That is often the most shocking thing. So in conclusion, I would say that the biblical idea of holy space supports the sociological definition as anywhere set apart and forbidden. But Christianity narrows the idea of holy. It is people who are holy. Buildings, objects, and places can be lent sacred status, but have no intrinsic or permanent holiness. Christianity also broadens and inverts the idea of holy. Holiness breaks into the mundane realm. It affirms spiritual holiness of people free from external things and is fundamentally inclusive. And finally, this is my last thought, a church or other holy space can be a broader concept than we think because it is ultimately about people. And with that, that's it. Questions and discussions. That is a picture of my daughter in our local Reims church. That is also a picture of my kids also at the now restored Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Lauren.
Oh, thank you. Oh, there was a lot there. There's just so much here. And I'm really excited about us talking about this. So I'm going to start with Jerry Lofthouse. Jerry, you're up first.
Thank you. Steve, I really appreciate your talk as well, and it puts it in a great perspective. But I must admit that I came to this discussion with certain images in my mind. And I want to raise that before we pass over it, which I think we probably ought. How do we deal with when we build a new church? We have this great dedicatory service. We have the best music. We invite in a special organist. We have a special potluck afterwards. We have these great prayers. We have the conference president there. Isn't that trying to replicate something maybe in sort of a presumptuous way that somehow we can approximate the temple that Solomon built and the wonderful God presence that he elicited? Isn't it disturbing that we should do that? Shouldn't we really downplay it? Otherwise, we get this mixed impression that makes your talk kind of void.
I absolutely agree with you. It's probably not one with a definitive answer, but I think I entirely agree where you're going. When we do those consecration services, it does give the impression that we're creating a building that's intrinsically and permanently holy. Yeah. And as you said, we're essentially attempting to replicate the Solomon's temple, which, as my presentation explored, I don't think that's at least how the disciples would have looked at it. So I'm not quite sure they would agree with that practice. I know that's our practice, but as I said in the talk, it's almost like I think over time, we've understood we shouldn't call our buildings temple. It's almost like in early Christian history and tradition, we've kept that, but then we've doesn't matter, we've co-opted the meaning in it. And again, it does remind me of last week's really good talk about the communion. about ordinances versus sacraments. It's kind of, we say that, oh, it's just an ordinance. I think maybe it was Lauren who made the point, but don't we we treat it as a de facto sacrament? And I think we're almost doing that with the buildings, aren't we, Jared? I mean, that's your sort of point. We say that it's people, but then how we treat the building, we treat it as essentially a temple.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's
I agree with you.
divisive and distracting.
I agree with you entirely with what you're getting at. It's a really good point.
Jerry, would you say the same thing is true when we, I had a ceremony done to me when I was not even 30 years old that made me an elder.
Right.
I could suddenly be called elder. My colleagues in the town where I lived, when they had that ceremony, they were called reverend. That was really special. I have to confess, I was uncomfortable with elder. I didn't like being called pastor. Somehow it conveyed something holy about me that didn't feel quite comfortable. Like I had to be something special that I
Sure.
kind of doubted I really was.
Yeah, a lot to live up to. And maybe Steve's concept of holiness residing in a person can be somehow achieved in a particulate form in your eldership. I'm not saying that when you change a tire, you don't always say the right things to the tire to get it to fit. But deep within, there's this particle of God's grace and holiness.
It's hard, and that's one of the questions I want to pursue with Steve when we get through a few more of these people, and that is the question of when he says holiness inheres into people. That I'm not sure I like any better than holiness being in the bricks and mortar. I'm troubled by that. But thank you, Gerald. That's a good question. But let's go on to Dr. Linda McZeal. Linda, it's nice to see you again. Let me ask you to open your microphone here. And there you go. Talk to us, Linda.
Hi, I just recently got my doctorate. That's why you see the DR, and I'm still celebrating.
Good for you.
The commencement is not going to be until September, but I have the actual piece of paper.
When
I
I
just
got
get kicked out of putting that. I'll take it down after.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. When I finished my doctorate, I
I'm
used the word
excited about
doctor for a few months too. So go ahead.
in the president's in President Trump cabinet. He has an office of faith, and Pastor Paula White is over that office, and she gave a sermon I think it might have been recently, not I don't know the exact date, but she says where she is, like when she's preaching, I guess, that's holy ground. And what President Trump, and in another sermon, she was saying what President Trump was saying was holy. But I'm just concerned about her saying when she was on White House ground, that made whatever room she was in, holy ground. If she was at a laundromat, it made that laundromat for that period that she was there doing her clothes, holy ground. And I just wanted to get your comments about it. Thank you.
I'm not sure if you saw Connie French. She actually made a comment, which I thought was quite interesting before we even started this, which seems to touch on this point, Linda. And she made the point when Moses... Hear me? Yep.
Go ahead.
You hear me? Sorry. Yep. Hear me? 1, 2, 3.
No, go ahead. You're on.
Okay. All right. Sorry. So she made the point when Moses met God in the burning bush. He said, take off your shoes for where you stand is holy ground. He didn't say where I stand is holy ground. So her point was that, well, actually, yes, in fact, if holiness resides in people, we do essentially take that holiness with us. So wherever Moses walked was holy ground. Now, I don't know where that ties into what Lauren wants to ask. That seems like an uncomfortable idea that holiness can follow you into the laundromat. but yeah, I would say yes, that isn't. I think that isn't. One is open to that view, and I'm open to that view. That you essentially do take the holiness with you. Now, I don't know if there's different circumstances, but I can imagine you could have a holy experience with another person in a laundromat. It doesn't have to be in a church. So I would definitely affirm that idea.
Oh, thank you, Linda. I'm trying to picture Paula White having to go and do her laundry in a laundromat. I'm having a little trouble with that since she's a multi-millionaire prosperity gospel person. But hey, that's not for me to judge. If she says she was in the laundromat, she was in the laundromat. Uh, Chris Widmer, you are up.
Well, I do most of my thinking and responding in the chat throughout the presentation, so I'm not even sure I have a cogent question necessarily prepared, other than maybe, since I'm a chaplain, discussing the holiness or the specialness of a human body in death, which I tend to spend a lot of time around these days in my work. I think it's great to treat the dead with a certain amount of dignity, and I always try to still refer to them by name and personhood when I'm in the presence of their newly mourning family, say in the sick room at a hospital where I work. But, you know, when we say holiness is in the person, and every person has holiness, then we might extend that back as the anti-abortion crowd to the very beginning of human life, that there is a certain holiness in every human being, no matter how old or no matter how living. So that's just kind of my comment. Maybe you can flesh that out a little bit more. But man, what a presentation. Just takes our mind all different directions. Also, maybe a comment of how we're expected to treat the communion bread and wine after communion is over. We kind of have a Catholic position that it should be buried, which we don't believe it's the body of Christ. So, you know, the deaconesses can send it home with others who need it, or the elders or deacons who are going to take it out. That is an interesting area to explore. How holy does the communion bread remain and the wine after the service?
So
Yes.
probably to do the easiest one first, which is the communion bread. Again, these are sort of, I don't want to give the impression I'm giving some sort of dogmatic answer. Often there's quite legitimate different positions we could take, but I do think the idea that we need to burn the bread or bury the bread after it's been blessed, I do think we're turning it essentially into a sacrament. And the problem I have with that is we are treating the bread as if the bread is intrinsically and permanently holy, as if it actually has, the bread itself has got some sort of magic. It's got some magical properties. Whereas I think the holiness is not the bread itself. It's the act of obviously us eating the bread in remembrance of Jesus. So after that has finished, the bread is just, again, ordinary bread. I don't think we almost are adopting that sacramental sort of theology to the bread. So look, I understand people trying to be respectful, and maybe that I understand that, but I personally, and going listening to Pastor Race's thing last week about the early church, I am not sure if the early church would have been, given it was an actual normal meal and it did have a liturgical component, I can't imagine they were burning all the bread after they'd finished it. I imagine they were wrapping up the bread because it was an actual meal and sending it to people. So with that,
Well, on that point, it raises an interesting statement. There is no statement that I know, maybe Lauren or any other minister logged in, or anybody who's familiar with the church manual. We might mention how the bread and the juice should be handled by the deaconess or so after the service, but there's not a statement as to what should happen to the water from the foot washing service. We've had this water in a holy moment.
Well, even better,
Down the drain it goes.
No, I even had a better one than that. I had the same thought, sorry. What about the baptismal font water? Is it also...
Oh my goodness.
Well, that's so. I mean, I can imagine that you could think of some inventive way to get rid of the foot washing water, but a baptismal font water is a lot of water. So if it's all somehow magically sacred, it's like a sacrament. We can't just pour it down the drain. We have to think of some sort of elaborate way, You know what I mean? So it is, you're absolutely right. We're treating the bread in sort of a sacramental form, but we don't treat the water from baptism or foot washing in that way. We just pour it down the drain, don't we? So I don't know.
Well, in my chaplain experience, I learned that there was a drain at the VA in a little room behind the chapel, and it looked like a sink to me. It even had a faucet, but I learned very quickly that that is not a drain. It was called a sacristy, where the priest could pour wine after communion, and it didn't go into the drain. It went into the ground, just into the dirt.
Which is weird because
Um,
that's almost, feeding the gods idea. But anyway, but linked to what you're asking, and I think Lauren has raised this, so I'll raise it myself. The idea of when we say grace, blessing the food, as if we're sort of magically doing something to the food. I can understand blessing the person who made the food. I can understand the blessing of our eating of the food. But as if when you bless, if I order McDonald's and I bless the burger, what am I expecting to happen to that burger? It's not going to suddenly become healthy as if it's got some sort of sacramental or magical, as if the burger itself is inherently holy. So I think there's holiness in the eating of the food. There's holiness in the person who prepared the food, but it's kind of interesting how we actually treat the item itself as if it has some, again, it's almost like magic. We treat it as if it's got magical properties.
Well, having never eaten a Big Mac in my life, I think that McDonald's food needs to be blessed 3 times at least before you eat it. So,
and then quickly, just the one about the deceased. Look, that's a very personal issue, so I'm very careful about. But I'm just going to talk about my own personal experience. So my father passed away last year. When he passed away, my mother and I organised the funeral, had a long discussion about what to do with his body. For the funeral in particular, would we arrange for the body to be there? Now, it was a lot more expensive. That was one issue. But from my mother's perspective and her Adventist beliefs about the study of the dead, she didn't feel it was necessary. Yes, it was respectful to the body, but she did not feel it was necessary for my father's body to be at the funeral, because she did not, in her belief, and so people can believe something else, but in her belief, the body itself, it did not have, it wasn't him. He's gone. His spirit's gone to God. He doesn't exist anymore. My father doesn't exist anymore. It's not like he's in some spirit form watching down from heaven. So from her point of view, she didn't feel it was necessary to have the body at the memorial service. But look, I understand that's a very personal thing, and other people will differ. But that's where she came to, and I broadly agree with that point of view. So certainly if someone decided to not have the body there, let's just say, I would support them in that decision, because I don't think you have to have the body there, as if the body remains a necessary component or whatever of the situation.
there is a mortician poet here in the United States who observes that now the practice is to not invite the dead to their own service in America and other places. We often don't have the body there, either in cremation ashes or as a casketed funeral. So it is a personal decision, and cultural mores change. I want to mention that when my mother died 5 years ago, we had a gray casket with a white interior. I had bought it online and had it delivered instead of buying the mortician's casket for twice the cost. We had just a family viewing, but I had Sharpie pens there, and we wrote on her casket messages of love and hope, Bible verses. I remember writing 1 Thessalonians 4, the verses there, I would not have you be ignorant. And then we didn't even have a public service. We had a private burial later that same day. And then we didn't have a memorial for 3 years later. So sometimes the pandemic changed how we do things even permanently. So thank you so much. It was so good to be here today to hear this presentation and to take part.
I agree. This has been an outstanding presentation. Chris, I've been in workers' meetings, pastors' meetings, where they had presentations on how to make a little wire frame to put the bread in and put it on your fireplace so you could burn it formally. It's a big thing. One of my friends told to write a story, and actually I published this on Adventist today. If you look it up, about being a poor kid growing up as an Adventist and how his mother was going to pour out the grape juice. And he said, we weren't rich enough to drink grape juice at home. So I grabbed it and I drank it. And my mother was very upset with me. And he still remembered that. He just died a couple of years ago. He still remembered that as being one of the very traumatic event, that his mother was so upset that he drank the grape juice that was left over. Interesting stories. Linda, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for your presentation. I have to confess to my shame that when I took my husband to lunch after Sabbath school, which is what I always do ahead of this presentation, I told him I thought it was going to be real ho-hum. But the fact is, your talk really just opened up so many avenues of thought and consideration. Well, I'm not going to raise it myself. I think there's an interesting contrast or correlation or bleeding in between purity and sacredness, which would be something fun for a future conversation. But I have a question. I'm old school, as they say. I was raised in an era where the sanctuary, as we called it, where the church service was conducted, we considered to be a sacred place. And I tell you, it wasn't all bad. People tended to be more quiet. There was a reverential attitude there that, to me, as a child and a young woman growing up, I considered to be favorable. But I was shocked to learn something recently that has caused me to have some questions. And actually, this realization came as a result of an article published in Adventist Today about an older man. I may not have the story exactly right, but the general gist is this. There was an older man who I think in early years had been in service to the church in some capacity, possibly as a pastor. But he approached a church in Colorado asking whether or not it might be possible for him and his husband to join the church there. And he did it very thoughtfully and carefully, approaching the pastor first. And then through the pastor's consideration, the board was involved and they gave thought to it and prayer and eventually decided that this man and his husband were very sincere in their desire to affiliate with the congregation and that they would, in fact, accept him and his husband as membership. And it was only then that I learned for the first time that the church itself does not own the real estate. The church itself, and this is not just in Colorado, as I understand it, this is certainly everywhere in the United States and perhaps elsewhere, that the conference owned the brick and mortar, the real estate. And when the conference became aware of the decision of this church, the conference indicated that if they pursued in that endeavor, that they would dissociate the church itself and take back the real estate, take it away from them. And I have to tell you, it sort of altered my view of sacred. I mean, is the church itself just simply institutional leverage, or is the sacredness imbued some other way? I just wonder what your thought is about that.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. It reminds me of a similar-ish story of Desmond Ford. I don't know if you know the story that when he died, and they were going to have the funeral at Avondale College, Avondale University, and similar to what you're discussing, to get around the board, the division or the union who owns the land basically said, well, you can't because we own the land, and they used a very similar tactic. And it was quite a low blow to do to a grieving widow, essentially, a few days before the funeral. But it does raise a broader question. I think I have written about this somewhere about space in terms of the bureaucracy and the leadership. And, if it's about people, I don't know, like the sacredness of the General Conference headquarters office, as opposed to the sacredness of that local congregation. I mean, obviously what you're describing is a deplorable situation. It's the same here in Australia. The local congregations don't own the land because they're not sort of legal entities. It's the state conference office that's the legal entity. But, I I don't know what else. What else were you looking? Trying to just think of what you were covering. I mean, obviously, it's a terrible, terrible situation. It does make you question. If that whole church had to up and move and rent out a school building next door, what was the church and what was sacred? Was it what was more sacred? Was it the empty church building that refused to allow the new members, or was it the school that showed the loving kindness to these people? And I would hope most of us would think it was the latter. It would be the school building with the people, not the bricks and mortar that was excluding people.
Yes, perhaps sacredness is like beauty in the eye of the beholder. So, okay. Thank you very much.
That's a good question, Linda. This thing of the conference owning the church and threatening it, churches with it, with their ownership of it, has come up quite a lot through the years, and it does call into question whether that is holy property or just a political football. And very good question. My friend Leland, it is your turn. How are you?
Well, how are you, Lauren? It's good to see you.
Just fine, thank you.
My question for Steve is, it seemed to me that you have presented a clear understanding of the New Testament, in that the New Testament, the only holy entity, is the living body of Christ, the membership, the people who form the community that represent his presence on earth, as Paul suggests that we're the living temple. So why not abandon all of the ideas that holiness is separable from that one entity? From my perspective, Christianity was designed to be cultureless and timeless, and I can think of no conception of holiness applied to objects, buildings, or the communion bread or anything else that isn't embedded in time and culture.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you. But so what's the sort of natural implication? Can you just repeat?
Well, it seems to me that the natural implication is that Christianity abandons any and all conceptions of holiness apart from the membership, the community of Christians gathered in his name. And as you quoted properly, I was pleased to see that, coming from an attorney and not a theologian, saying that where two or three are, I am. You use that text, which to me defines the essence of holiness within Christianity, because it's a timeless concept.
I think, I don't know if this answers your question or not, but it is interesting, and it relates to what Jerry raised as well. You certainly get the sense in the New Testament it was pretty simple in that it was the body of believers, that was it. And then over time we've got buildings, we've transformed them into essentially temples, we've built institutions. Look, I'm not against any of that per se, but I do agree with you. It is funny if we're trying to sort of replicate, Herod's temple or something in all its forms. Again, there's nothing wrong with a hospital. I use that example at the end. That I think is a holy place. There's nothing wrong with owning institutions, but I do agree with you. There is a danger, and this goes to our previous discussion as well. We sort of build this institutional structure as if the structure itself is the holy thing. Like the church. I work for the church. I get paid for by the church. Mm-hmm. I think we start to associate that with the structure, the physical buildings, the systems, and I think most people would pay lip service and say no, it means the people. But I think, to be honest, a lot of people they wouldn't really think it is the people. They would think it is the physical, it's the structures and the institutions and the buildings. So I think if by that you mean should we sell all our buildings and looked at, I don't know, it's hard to do once we're already in, we've established this apparatus. I guess if one was starting a new organisation, that would be and I think that's very much the mindset of some of our pioneers, I believe, probably would have those thoughts, whether we should be acquiring such things. But look, I don't know the answer, to be honest, what the answer to that is. And I as much put it back to you as to what you think really, because I'm fundamentally agreeing with you. I guess I'm how would one go about it, given we do have very entrenched, notions of the sacred, and that extends to our structures and our institutions and our buildings and everything else. And our church manual, we're talking about a church manual, and there's a manual about what to do with the communion bread. I mean, that itself is, the manual, what does that gain some holy status in itself? The fact that
Steve, there is a holy recipe for the communion bread in the church manual, and I've heard people say that that's the recipe you need to use because that's the one that's approved by the General Conference. That makes it holy. I guess, Leland, the argument could be made that we treat holy spaces, for example, as holy, or the bread and wine as holy, because it reminds us of the holiness in people somehow, that it reflects back on, I remember one time we had a little, we had a little praise band in a church that I pastored. And one day we were playing around and practicing, and I got out my harmonica and I started playing some blues licks and singing the Steamroller Blues, and I felt so guilty. It was so much fun. I mean, it sounded so great, but I felt so guilty, and I quickly pulled it to a halt. I said, "Here's the pastor standing up in the church playing the blues." And I apologized to everybody and said, "No, it was so much fun." Part of me wants to say we didn't do anything wrong, but I still pulled it to a halt.
No, I would agree. You didn't. And just to extend the conversation just a bit, I appreciate, and this relates to Steve as well, this is how I would answer. And I think this is where I'm going, Lauren. You published an article, and I appreciate, you and Adventist Today published an article, What's in a Name, where I went into the issue of the fact that I believe the New Testament consciously avoided the word naos, temple, and avoided the word synagogue because they had political associations, and Christianity was something new, and they didn't want to tie it to the old holy ideas of the past. And I think that if we're going to meet the challenges of the era that we live in, we have to accept the fact that the Spirit was touching you playing that blues moment. There's nothing inherently wrong. And I had this discussion when I was a member of the radio board, KANG, we called it, KANG, at PUC when I was a student there, about what kind of music to play on Sabbath, And the classic example to me, to share a story, my good buddy still, and at the time, was the first chair trumpet in the PUC orchestra. And he was invited to play the special music, as it's called, for the worship hour at the Sanitarium Church. And he chose, purposely because of who he was and how his thinking was, and I suppose you can see now how warped I have become, he chose to play a piece from the bedroom scene of an opera for trumpet. And he just called it whatever, solo for trumpet in E minor or major, whatever it was. And the people came out of the church telling him how blessed they were. Had they known that piece of music, they would have been mortified. And he laughed about that for decades.
Yeah, I get it. It's complicated.
Well,
Thank you, Leland. And yes, that was, if you guys, you need to look up Leland's piece that he wrote on why they chose to call it synagogue rather, or church, ecclesia, rather than temple. That was a good piece. Um, should I address you as 845?
Eduardo, I used to use the iPad and now I'm using the iPhone.
Okay, Eduardo, go ahead. Your turn.
Thank you. Steve, I have the idea that the only holy thing is God, and where his presence comes, even to a temple or person or action, that's what makes them holy. But let me tell you that Passover was only for uncircumcised people, and Passover became communion, which is only for the disciples. And in order to be a disciple, you need to be baptized. And I think that the shoes of Moses and the circumcisions are symbol of sin. You want to become holy, you need to take your shoes out of you. You need to be circumcised. You need to be washed away of your sin in order to come to my presence. And I have the impression that you are making the point that actions, kindness, taking care of the poor, by itself become holy. But I don't think so, because a lot of nuns and priests and a lot of people that are doing terrible things are doing the same things to God and the same things to the world. So I think that purity is synonymous of holiness. What do you think?
Look, I'm not sure this is one where we may disagree or not. It depends if I understand your point correctly. So, for example, the Adventist Church, someone can correct me, traditionally is practiced open communion. So you don't have to be baptized to take communion. And I think that's a good thing. I've heard the arguments about the Passover. I think if you go back to the original story in Exodus, just trying to remember the story about who was allowed to be there or could participate. But sort of look to the New Testament. Of course, the obviously the circumcision issue was a large debate, and you know, going to those Isaiah and those Old Testament texts. Obviously, one of the big debates was whether to be included, you needed to be circumcised. And of course, the church decided that that wasn't necessary. But if you're saying, just sort of say your last bit again about, because I am saying holiness is not defined. It's not an excluded concept. Holiness, a holy space could be you know, if there's a spot where someone breaks down on the side of the road and you help them, that can be a holy space. I am saying that. I'm saying that the concept is broader. A hospital can be a holy space. I'm not saying it has to be limited to a church building that's been consecrated and everyone's been baptized. So I am taking a broader view of holiness and holy space than perhaps you are, if you're saying it has to be.
Steve, let me say something here. I know since 1980 we have open communion, but I have the records from 1867 to 1980, we have close communion. And if you study how it became open communion, it's just incredible how they changed it. They have no basis for it. And the record is on the church bulletins. So I want to clarify that. Yes, we do practice open communion, but we do it since 1980. Sister White never agreed with open communion. She voted for close communion. Thank you for your answer.
No worry. Well, I would basically say the essence of my whole talk is to promote open communion. So that's almost the essence of what I'm saying, which may obviously be different to your point of view.
But that's an interesting bit of history there, Eduardo. I did not know that history of open communion, that it was not always the case. I thought that was something that we inherited from the Methodists. So very interesting. Thank you for that. Thank you, Eduardo. I'm going to move on to Professor Thompson here. Karsten, your turn.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Stephen. You have probably one of the sessions that has stimulated me most in a long time. You've just taken everything and turned it upside down and inside out, and I love that. And then I got to think, well, of course you walk upside down in Australia compared to us, so that probably explains it. I've scribbled down tons of stream of consciousness notes here. And when I think of when I lived in Battle Creek and got a cough here, when we showed visitors around at the Battle Creek Cemetery, where Ellen White's grave, Uriah Smith's grave, and all the Kellogg's graves and so on, you know, this was a very holy, special thing. We showed the house where Ellen White wrote The Great Controversy, and it was with great awe that I, as a young teenager, was telling people about this. And then I rewind the film back to a recent visit to Elmshaven, where I was a visitor there, Ellen White's final mansion. And I walked out of there, I was ready to barf. I was just grossed out by the lifting Ellen White up and the Bible and all the other stuff on a pinnacle that I felt it was sacrilegious in one respect. It just shows how much I've changed during that time. So, but there's two questions that I have to you, Stephen. One is, you don't talk a lot about the mystical aspects of a church building, the mystical aspects of prayer, of worship, of being lifted by music, and those type of things. And I think some of the great church buildings, some of the great cathedrals have that impact on me personally, just like when I walk in the John Muir Woods north of San Francisco. I feel that I'm walking in a great cathedral, and I feel very, very humble, and I feel very much awed. And I think that in itself is an important thing for me. But on the other hand, when I look at these great cathedrals and the great buildings, be it at Loma Linda or Andrews University or wherever it is, have you thought about how these are used as a symbol of power of the church over people, and the enormous power that the church, not to ignore the Roman church, has by its pomp and circumstance and its awe-inspiring buildings and so on? It sort of makes people very meek, not only with respect to God, but probably more so with respect to the church. And I think there the church, with its pompousness, is coming in and replacing the worship and the awe of God. So my question to you, what about the mystical aspect, and what about the power aspects?
Yeah, no, very good points. And to be honest, I don't really disagree with you. I think if you listen to my presentation, you could wrongly think I was some sort of iconoclast that we should, smash up all the buildings, and they don't. I 100% agree with you. Almost every day I walk down to Reims Cathedral and sit in there and, almost in a prayer or meditate just for 10 minutes. Now, clearly, why am I doing that? Obviously, something by the building is inspiring me, or it's a quiet space. So I definitely agree with you on that. I think, and maybe, maybe my talk does come across very iconoclastic by emphasizing people. But all I would say is it's hard to sort of, perhaps because it is mystical. That's, I agree with you on that as well. It's almost a mystical topic, this idea of the spirit living inside of us. And one part I didn't even cover in the topic, it was there, but I took it out. The idea of the spirituality almost even going from person to person with the whole idea of a holy kiss. Some of these things are quite mystical. They're hard to pin down. I guess I was trying to get at that, yes, when I sit in Reims Cathedral, it is the architecture that's inspiring me. But at the same time, is it the architecture, or is it also my own inward reaction to the architecture? It's quite hard to sort of describe that, but if you sort of take the person element out of it, all I'm saying, I don't think the building in itself has some intrinsic holiness if you take all the people out of it. So I agree with you. It is a hard idea to grasp. But look, if the temple in Jerusalem didn't have that inherent holiness, then I do question to what extent even the most beautiful building in the world can have that inherent holiness. So I'm not saying it's not holy. I'm not saying the architecture isn't important. All I'm saying is there has to have a person element in there for that holiness to sort of manifest.
I agree.
And again, maybe I'm not articulating it in the best way.
It's how we react to what we see, but when we see a beautiful sunset, that it can also be an
exactly.
awe-inspiring.
If you look at nature, people often say they see God in nature. But when you think about nature, it's actually a very, if we think of the idea of sacred as separate from the everyday, well, nature is often very everyday. It's actually open space. And yet we can be inspired by those everyday space experiences. Like you say, a sunset. There's a sunset every single day, and yet the sunset you see tomorrow might be the thing that inspires you. Right. Now, as to the power thing, absolutely. I think that actually feeds on to the discussion we were just having about imbibing this notion of holiness in buildings and structures and objects and institutions. There's nothing particularly holy about, some of these buildings. Yes, they inspire us, but they also represent powers that have done much wrong. So look, I agree with literally everything you say. I agree that my talk could be taken in the wrong way, as if I'm suggesting.
No, I don't take it wrong.
Look, I always thought when I prepare the presentation, if I just stopped the whole presentation with the punchline, people are holy, and then that's walked away, I think you would get that impression. But that's why I was really trying to emphasize that buildings can be holy, but that holiness is essentially lent. I think I use that term lent to emphasize it's a holiness, but it's a holiness that is not permanent or intrinsic. It's a holiness that has to sort of flow from people, and that includes people's reactions to that space.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That would be interesting to have a class sometime. Somebody who is trained in art and aesthetics and could talk to us about how and why we respond to certain great works of art and architecture and music and other things in a certain way that is very evocative to us. Obviously, we respond powerfully to these things.
Right. And we can
be
manipulated by it.
Yeah, we can be manipulated by it. Right. So one of the reasons, Karsten, as a very sort of cerebral sort of person, I really hate it when somebody plays really beautiful music and invites me to do something,
Right.
I rebel against it. I say, no, I am not getting up out of my chair and coming to the front because you're doing that.
Just a little add-on anecdote, if I may. We've recently been blessed by having a missionary from the United States sent out by the General Conference to Copenhagen.
Hmm.
And the General Conference pays for it. And he and his family have been moved here for about 5 to 7 years to try to do some church planting in Copenhagen. And his name is Rob Falkenberg III, so you probably know his parents and grandparents. And I've talked with him several times and about how he's going to go about church planting and so on. And I said to him, Rob, I said, where was Jesus' church? Jesus didn't have any buildings. He just wandered around. And when I talk with Rob, he's taking a similar approach. He's just trying to mingle with people. He's a big outdoors man. He signs up for running competitions, wants to run in the Copenhagen Marathon next year, signed up for a fitness center where he'll meet people where they are. And I said to him, Rob, you're doing exactly what Jesus did. He went out to the people where they were. And at the same time, we've had what we call a cafe church in Copenhagen, which sort of disintegrated in the past 10 years. And what has happened then, suddenly we have pop-up churches, not in the physical church building, but young people meeting together to eat together. And there's about 3 of these groups informally meeting in Copenhagen now, studying the Bible around the table where they eat together. And I think that's a beautiful and innovative view of church planting.
Yeah, there's holiness there, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Ed Reifsnyder right now. Ed, there you go.
Good afternoon. I'd like to continue this conversation that's been going on for the last 2 or 3 minutes. Karsten brought up the question of the mystical, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. In spite of the assertions of my elders when I was growing up, I don't view space as sacred. But space and the things that occur within space can really enhance our attempts to connect with the sacred. I worked on a really, really fun consulting project in which I had to engage with a lot of urban planners and architects and designers and learn from them that the design of space is critical to the effectiveness of what happens within. That it can really enhance or do nothing for the planned activities in that space. And so maybe instead of concerning ourselves with the question of whether space is sacred, we should engage in real intentionality in asking ourselves, how can we use our space to help us connect with the sacred? In other words, how we can connect with God. And I'm so afraid that so often in Adventism, our spaces don't really do much to enhance this experience. They just don't. They're boxes, essentially. And so often what happens within those spaces doesn't seem intentionally designed to enhance our connection with the sacred. If you have a church service, there's going to be a whole bunch of people who want to talk in it. And generally they do. And we engage in all kinds of things of deacons walking up and down the aisles collecting things. And so I just feel like we have been so utilitarian in our approach to space and to church and to services that we don't really assist the congregant in experiencing connection with the sacred. And maybe we're afraid of that. Maybe we're afraid of having something like a cathedral. I can tell you that one of the most attractive Seventh-day Adventist churches I've ever been in was the Tacoma Park, Maryland Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it actually looks like a real church. And we recently attended a Catholic service. It was some special occasion, I don't remember what. The space and the activity that occurred was very conducive to connecting with the sacred, intentionally designed that way. So I feel like we have a lot to learn where we don't necessarily consider our churches as the space itself is sacred, but how we can use that space to enhance the worshiper's experience. There was no question.
Very good points. I would agree with everything you said. Absolutely. I had sort of two almost different thoughts at the same time. One is, yes, the idea that we just have boxes and rather than try to make things beautiful. Obviously, there's sort of two arguments there. One is about the use of space. If we have a box, somehow that'll seem more friendly to people who aren't used to church. But I agree with you. Again, why do I go to Reims Cathedral almost every day and sit in there? I sit there because it's beautiful and I get this, it triggers something within me. So I agree with you. And I think it does tie in what I was trying to get to at the end, that our spaces have to be people focused, but that includes the mystical experience, of course. They should be designed to trigger those responses inside of us. Not because, again, the building itself is magical; it has some sort of magical properties, but to, as you said, to sort of to induce those feelings within us. The other thought I had whilst you were saying that, which might be the opposite of what you're saying, I don't know. I'm not sure if you're aware that there's a lot of discussion in church design these days, and I think maybe Lauren's right. We need to get an architect in here because the planner sort of thinks of these macro spaces and all the rest, and it's the architect who gets right into the design of things. But there's a lot of discussion about foyers. I don't know if everyone's aware of the big discussions about foyers. So a lot of churches are really investing in making foyers bigger and better. And why is that? Because we've always treated the so-called sanctuary as the most important part of the church, but actually where people connect and make friendships and find out about how is Mrs. Smith going on, and often it's actually in the foyer. It's the space that we kind of think is a leftover or a bit of an in-between space. So some churches are actually, including my own Adventist church back in Perth, really investigating expanding the foyer, because that is a space which traditionally we have not used well. It's an afterthought, but actually, if it's used well in an intentional way, that actually might make the difference. And I use another example on this. Our greeter, I won't name him because he'd be shamed, but our greeter at our local church in Perth, honestly, he almost is the church, because when you come to our local church, he has a team. They're extremely deliberate in how they connect with you and meet you. And the success of our church is almost owed to his team, and they essentially use the foyer as their space. So going back to your point, I think we're not very intentional in how we use space. We have a bit of a box, and we have 3 hymns and a prayer or whatever we do, and that's the end. And that clearly isn't using space in an intentional way to connect with people. So I think that ranges everything from making churches more beautiful, I agree with you, to also maybe making the foyer bigger and better so people can connect.
Well, I have a surprise for you. I invited one of my favorite architects here today. Mark Moreno is a professor of architecture at Andrews University, and you'll find this interesting. Mark is an Episcopalian, but he teaches architecture at Andrews. I've known Mark for a long time. Just think he's a super interesting guy. Mark, join in this conversation. Forgive me, Doug, Ed, for skipping over you, but I thought, why don't we just go right into this? Talk to us a little bit about holy spaces.
Oh, Lauren, you drew me in. I will say in recent years, it has not been easy being an Episcopalian at Andrews University. But I won't go into the details of that. But I will say it has been a blessing in my life to be there and still there. As an Episcopalian, I used to walk every morning, early morning, with an Episcopal priest. And we talked everything from theology to, and I'm not a theologian. I'm an architect. I'm not even a licensed architect, but I'm in that architecture space. There's a great book called Sidewalks in the Kingdom, written by a pastor slash new urbanist, Eric. I think Eric O. Jacobson, something like that. Anyway, this walk with the priest every morning was always enlightening, and I was challenging the notion of the communion as the body of Christ. I'm a former Catholic. I grew up Catholic, and just taking communion in the Episcopal Church is different than taking communion in other churches, especially Adventist Church. But I was challenging the notion that the bread is not the body of Christ, and he said, consider that God is in the element. And we always hear God, God's the creator of all things, and God is in everything. And so that helped me to sort of transition and understand, when I'm receiving communion, that there's a holiness about the act. There's a holiness about all things that are present in that act. And and so I'll leave it at that for others' interpretation. But there was a point in time in the architecture school when our chair asked us to start thinking about offering classes where we're learning how to do church designs. And there are moments when the non-Adventist in the faculty sits back, and I wasn't the only one. At that time, there were a number of us. And so I sit back and I let I'm in their house. I say the Adventists have to figure this out. Where should it go in the curriculum and who should do it? It never dawned on me until maybe 45 minutes into the conversation. They weren't coming up with a conclusion about where in the curriculum it should go. And so finally, I said, well, it could go in placemaking studio. And an Adventist colleague snapped his fingers and looked, pointed at me, and he goes, that's it. And I said, but I'm not Adventist. And he said, but you come from a tradition that does good churches, that builds good churches, to the previous presenters or to the previous comments. And I come from a tradition that makes good buildings. They do go overboard for sure, in my estimation, in my experience, way overboard a lot of times. But architecture, just as a profession, as a discipline, as an act, it needs to be led and driven by something more than just utility. And Marcus Vitruvius said 2,000 years ago that architecture should be firm and useful and delightful. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I have a class assignment that I give. Well, actually, when I started designing churches with my classes, I had to do some unlearning, because the first time I gave a program for a church, I said, the church needs an altar, and I was educating the students from my former Catholic and current Episcopalian perspective. And we visited some Adventist churches, and we visited PMC at Andrews, and we were talking with one of the pastors there, and they noted that the new pulpit was really exciting because this was a shorter pastor, and it was fully glass, it was fully transparent. And I asked, was the decision to make this pulpit glass in part to draw the pastor closer to the to break down the hierarchy and separation from the congregation? And the pastor said, no, there was not any discussion about theology when designing the pulpit, and it struck me as odd because, like, in an Episcopal church or in a Catholic church, nothing happens in the sanctuary or on the altar or the rostrum that doesn't go through committees and some sort of theological vetting. So there was a day when we were designing the churches, and I got into a little bit of a debate with one of the students, where I said, so I understand the altar doesn't, the table you're serving communion from is not considered an altar, but the table, the act of taking communion, does it matter what kind of table you would specify for the building? And a student was, saying, no, it doesn't matter. And I said, but this is the table where communion is being served, and he kept saying, but it doesn't matter. And I said, okay, I get that, but would you specify this table? And I pointed to the table that I was standing next to, and it was a plastic laminated table with metal legs, and it was worn and torn, and I said, would you specify, as an architect, would you specify this table for PMC, that this would be the table that's used for communion? And he said, yes, that's fine. It doesn't matter. I said, but you're an architect. So let's go to your homes. Which is the most important table in your house? Oh, the dining table. Well, how come? Well, because that's where we have family meal. And that's where we have celebrations of Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I said, so okay, so aesthetically, it matters at your house, but not at the church. And he said, well, we put a tablecloth on it. And I said, but why? To make it look nicer. And so it's just like this back and forth kind of conversation. So I was unlearning and trying to help students to understand that we do have a visceral and emotional and psychological reaction to things, but it doesn't mean that we're worshiping them. It doesn't mean that we're thinking that they themselves are holy without the presence of people's doings and actions around them. And ultimately, I think in my classes, I'll end with this and then open for discussion. I have students designing memory objects. No, bringing a memory object to class, a different class. Bring in an object that evokes some kind of memory for you. And the students bring in things that make them cry when they tell the story about them. And it's something that their father gave them, their mother gave them, their grandmother gave them. And it reminds them of these events in their lives. And I share a brick from my dad's restaurant. It was a part of a brick oven that my dad, when we closed the restaurant, he said, go and take things and just go. And I'm closing the restaurant. And I took this brick that was a part of the brick oven, and the brick had fallen off of the oven. It had been dislodged for years and years, but we always have somehow put it back where it belonged. And I finally described how it reminded me of the partnership of my father and his business partner, Pete. And a student said, I don't buy it. That's just a brick. And I said, yeah, but you couldn't you couldn't take this brick away from me. And he said, would you sell it for $1 million? And I said, absolutely. If you have it, you want to give me $1 million. But I would do something with that $1 million to honor the partnership of my dad and his business partner. And I said, what was your object that you brought? And he said, oh, I didn't bring it. It's an object, but the object that I wanted to talk about was this object that I gave to my girlfriend. I made a box for her. And then he went into this great detail about describing it, inlaid wood and symbols and stuff, all that it meant to him. And he gave it to his girlfriend. And I said, so that's really cool. I'm glad you bought, and he goes, but if I ever break up with her, I told her I want it back. And and I said, so in some ways you're valuing this box, the importance of this box, in some ways over your own relationship with your girlfriend. Anyway, I'll stop there and just open for conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was, by the way, I was a part of the evaluation groups there during those few years when you did church designs.
Mhm.
And it was interesting. I have to agree with you that for most they were young people, and so I understand. But I have to agree that for a lot of them, their understanding of the aesthetics of what makes a setting for church was pretty primitive, um, in lots of ways. And even I knew that. And I'm not an architect. I did build a church. Very good, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stephen, are you still there?
Well, yeah, no, look, that was really good comments, Mark. Again, I think I would agree with everything you said. I think we can see from this discussion, you can easily, which I think would be wrong, to go to two extremes. One is to suggest that, again, I think your statements, especially at the end, were really spot on, as if the table was like a magical table and it had sort of inherent magical properties. I don't really believe that, but I also agree with you that a plastic table for communion is not a good idea. Not so much because it's made of plastic, but if the whole point is to induce inside yourself a particular feeling or response, a faith response, then I think aesthetics do matter. So I agree with you on that. And even with your brick, I couldn't help but think, yeah, it's a very good example. Inherently to me, that brick doesn't mean much, but to you it means a lot. But I was also thinking, if you become a rich and famous person, actually your brick might mean something to me as well. So it's interesting how we ascribe value to certain things. So yeah, good comments, and I agree with everything you said. And again, I think from this topic, you can really, if you sort of misunderstand it, sort of drop off both. You can go to extremes. You can be iconoclast, let's smash everything. And you can go to the other extreme and treat objects as if, in an almost pagan way, as if objects have some sort of inherent magical property. And I would say I'm not supporting either of those two extremes.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, great. Mark, so glad to see you here. It's been a while. We need to get together. We've been talking about doing an architecture field trip sometime together, since Mark is just up at Andrews and I'm in Columbus. Doug, I'm going to get you in here before we finish up.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And it inspired several reactions, both in the presentation and the comments since then. I have to question whether all the disciples were actually baptized, and Judas in particular, so I'm not sure about that. And it did occur to me that the 12-step programs eschew particularly the ownership of property and sort of physical infrastructure, because they focus very much on the process of connecting with other people. Maybe there's some concept that could be taken from that, as opposed to our Adventist idea of property ownership, ABCs, as most evangelicals do: attendance, buildings, and cash. But I really appreciated Eduardo's comment, perhaps not in the way you intended it. God is holy. And so I take from that, I think, along with what you said, Steve, that if we're created in his image, and if God, in fact, was the creator of all things, much has been mentioned, then there is some sense in which we are to each other God. And there's this whole controversial thing about David being the son of God. And so I try to think in that vein, what are the characteristics of God? Well, if it's Emmanuel, God with us, he's a God that wants to associate, wants to be with us. Not that the object of his association, the tabernacle in the wilderness, was as holy as I think maybe it was regarded, but the idea of associating, of being together, the ecclesia, the congregation. And I love your idea of changing a flat tire beside the road for somebody that isn't capable of that as an act of God. Sometimes we use the act of God in the legal sense for things that aren't very godlike. And I love that sense of kindness. 50 years ago, when I was a member of the Loma Linda University Church, there was an Adventist architecture there who came and did a presentation on architecture and Christianity. And boy, it was eye-opening of all the symbols, particularly that tend to diminish our humanity in order to elevate the idea of God's holiness in contrast to us. And I'm not sure that a lot of the architecture always had the effect of that, but I see these churches, like there's one in France in Albi, where the entire town is dwarfed by the size of the church and seems to be for the purpose of diminishing the humanity of us. And so I like the idea of what are the characteristics of God that bring us delight, as Mark was mentioning, I think, delight, joy, of connection, of beauty. Somebody mentioned the holy kiss. Now, the holy kiss, uninvited, would be an assault in a legal sense, but it could be a very encouraging and connecting kind of thing. I remember as a very young person, the communion service in which I was forbidden for taking the emblems because I was not yet baptized. And so in that sense, I think open communion is a perfect progress at being inclusive to young people who have not yet been baptized, but have this sense of wanting to be close to God and responding to that sense of that. So those are some of the things that I see. The elaborate preparation for the communion service that I remember as a young person, where it's covered and it takes 12 minutes for the deaconesses to uncover it and fold all that stuff. Boy, that was anxiety producing. I was afraid somebody was going to drop something and it was going to be a liturgical disaster. And so the things that I think are holy are the things that connect us to the characteristics of God. And boy, I see that in your presentation and in many of the comments, and I'm very grateful for that.